In the early hours of Sunday, July 12, 2026, the sky over the city of Syzran in Russia's Samara region filled with the sound of engines that did not belong to any aircraft the residents recognized. It began, as these nights so often do now, with a warning. Around 3 in the morning local time, regional authorities issued an alert about a possible drone threat in the area. For roughly 2 hours, the warning simply sat there. A notification on a phone screen, an official bulletin repeated on local channels, the kind of thing people in this part of Russia have learned to live alongside without necessarily believing something will come of it. Then, at around 5 in the morning, the waiting ended. Residents began reporting a series of explosions, one after another, sharp enough to rattle windows and pull people out of bed. Within minutes, the first videos began appearing on social media and on Telegram channels that tracked this war from a distance, filmed by ordinary people standing in courtyards and on balconies, phones held up toward a horizon that was no longer dark, but glowing orange underneath a spreading column of black smoke. The footage that circulated in the hours after tells its own story better than any official statement could. It shows a crowd of onlookers, some still in their nightclothes, gathered at a safe distance from the industrial zone, watching the sky. Voices overlap in the recordings, some panicked, some strangely calm, the particular calm of people who have been through this before and know that panic doesn't put out fires or shoot down drones. There is a sense, in listening to that raw audio, of a small city processing something enormous happening at its edge. People point, they call to each other to look. Someone says, "Stop filming, or you'll draw attention." Someone else says, "A drone just flew directly overhead." Another voice reports that shooting can be heard somewhere in the distance, presumably air defense trying and mostly failing to intercept the incoming aircraft. Explosions continue through the recording, some distant and dull, others sharp enough to suggest they landed close to where the crowd was standing. Someone points out that this particular drone seems to be heading for a smokestack. Someone else notes that more are still arriving, 1, 2, 3, a wave rather than a single strike. It is the sound of a community watching its own skyline burn, filmed not by journalists or the military, but by the people who happened to be standing there when it happened, their phones the only cameras nearby. By the time the sun came up, it was clear this was not a minor incident. Photographs and videos taken from further away showed a column of thick black smoke rising for what witnesses described as kilometers, visible from across the city and beyond, the unmistakable signature of a hydrocarbon fire burning at industrial scale. Russian authorities, through regional officials and eventually through statements that filtered out via monitoring channels, confirmed that a drone attack had struck the area. Though, as is typical in these situations, official Russian sources were slow and sparse with details about the extent of the damage, the number of drones involved, or whether there had been any casualties. The target, multiple sources quickly converged on, was the Syzran oil refinery, one of the largest and most important fuel-producing facilities in the entire Samara region, and a long-standing subsidiary of Rosneft, the Russian state oil giant that forms one of the financial backbones of the country's war economy. To understand why this particular facility matters, it helps to understand what it actually does. The Syzran refinery is not a small or marginal operation. Depending on the source and the year being measured, its annual processing capacity sits somewhere between 7 and nearly 9 million tons of crude oil, with most recent estimates converging around 8.5 to 8.9 million tons annually. That is a substantial slice of Russia's overall refining capacity, generally put at somewhere around 3% of the country's total national output, which for a single facility is significant. The plant does not just produce raw fuel oil, it refines crude into the full spectrum of products a modern economy and a modern military both depend on. Gasoline for civilian vehicles, diesel that meets European-grade Euro 5 standards, aviation kerosene that can be used to fuel military jets, fuel oil for heavy industry and shipping, bitumen for road construction, and liquefied hydrocarbon gases. It is, in other words, a facility that sits at the intersection of Russia's civilian fuel economy and its military logistics chain, supplying fuel that keeps trucks, tanks, aircraft, and industry moving both within the region and, according to Ukrainian assessments, feeding directly into the supply lines that support Russian forces fighting in and around Ukraine. Geographically, the refinery sits more than 800 kilometers from the nearest point on the Ukrainian border, deep in what used to be considered the safe interior of Russian territory, far beyond the reach of most conventional artillery, far beyond the range that most people assumed drones of Ukrainian origin could realistically travel and still deliver a meaningful payload. That assumption has been steadily eroding for more than a year now, and the strike on July 12th is one more data point in that erosion. The distance matters because it signals something about the reach of the weapons being used, and by extension, about how much of Russian territory can genuinely be considered out of range anymore. A refinery on the Volga, closer to Kazakhstan than to Kiev, catching fire from a drone strike is not an incremental escalation so much as a demonstration that the geography of this war has fundamentally changed. According to reporting attributed to Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, the strike was carried out overnight by operators from what was described as the first separate center, working alongside the 414th Brigade, sometimes referred to informally as Birds of Magyar, a reference to the call sign of a well-known Ukrainian drone commander. The operation is reported to have involved coordination with Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate and the State Border Guard Service, suggesting a level of interagency planning consistent with what Ukrainian officials have referred to as their long-range deep strike campaign, sometimes labeled in official communications as Operation Deep Strike. In a statement attributed to the unmanned systems forces and circulated through Ukrainian channels, officials described the Syzran facility as one of Rosneft's largest refineries and a key enterprise for the southern Volga region, and confirmed that, as a result of the strike, quote, a large-scale fire broke out at the facility, with detailed information about the consequences still being clarified at the time of the initial announcement. What quickly emerged once open-source analysts began combing through the footage circulating from Syzran was that the strike did not simply hit some peripheral storage tank or a symbolic corner of the plant. It appears to have struck at the structural heart of the refinery's actual production process. Analysts working with a Ukrainian open-source intelligence channel that closely tracks refinery damage across Russia reported that drones had hit the plant's primary crude processing units directly, the AVT-5 and AVT-6 installations, which together represent the facility's entire capacity to take raw crude oil and begin turning it into anything usable. The AVT-5 unit was assessed as accounting for roughly 30% of the plant's primary processing capacity, translating to around 2.6 million tons annually, while the larger AVT-6 unit was assessed as responsible for the remaining 70%, on the order of 6.3 million tons a year. Combined, according to this analysis, the strike appears to have damaged or disabled effectively the entirety of the refinery's primary distillation capacity, the full 8.9 million tons. There is an important distinction in industrial terms between hitting a storage tank, which is dramatic and visually striking but often replaceable or repairable within days, and hitting a primary distillation unit, which is not. A refinery's primary units are where crude oil first enters the process and is separated by heat into its component fractions, the starting point for everything downstream. Without a functioning primary unit, a refinery cannot begin the refining process at all, regardless of how much crude oil is sitting in its storage tanks or how intact the rest of the facility remains. Analysts pointed out, in blunt terms, that with no crude distillation running, the plant simply produces nothing. That is a very different outcome than a fire that burns off some fuel storage and is extinguished within a day. A hit like this can take weeks or months to repair, sometimes longer if the damage is severe enough to require replacement parts that are difficult to source under sanctions, since much of the specialized equipment used in Russian refineries historically came from Western or Allied suppliers who are no longer selling to Russian industry. One detail from the incident stands out as almost incidental in the way that real events often produce accidental consequences beyond what was planned. Open-source analysts examining footage from the strike identified what appears to have been a hit on a catalytic reforming unit, specifically identified as an LCH-35/11600 reformer, a piece of equipment used to produce the high-octane components that gasoline cannot be properly blended without. According to the analysis, this particular hit looks to have been unintentional, essentially a matter of the reformer's tall stack structure appearing directly in the flight path of an incoming drone. In footage attributed to a Ukrainian monitoring channel, a drone is seen approaching, and the smokestack of the reforming unit comes into view directly ahead of it. The drone's warhead appears to detonate in an airburst directly above the structure, and the resulting shrapnel cloud tears through the equipment below. Later footage reportedly shows this unit burning as well. Whether by design or by chance, the practical effect was the same. Another critical piece of the refining chain taken offline. One more layer of damage stacked onto a facility that was already losing its primary distillation capability. This was notably not the first time this particular refinery has been hit, and understanding its history helps explain why some analysts describe this strike as different in scale from what came before, even though the target itself is a familiar one. The Syzran facility has been targeted repeatedly over roughly the past year of the war. Drone strikes hit the plant on 3 separate occasions, in August of 2025 alone. Another strike came on April 18th of this year. Then, on May 21st, drones struck again, this time seriously damaging the AVT-6 unit, which at that point was responsible for more than 70% of the plant's total capacity, and forcing what was described as a prolonged full stop in operations. Reuters, citing sources familiar with the matter, reported several days later, on May 25th, that the plant had in fact suspended operations following that attack. At the time, that May strike was already being described as the 11th recorded strike on the Syzran facility since the drone campaign against Russian refineries began in earnest. The July 12th strike, then, represents at minimum a 12th documented attack on this single facility. an extraordinary number of repeated strikes on one target, suggesting both a persistent Ukrainian determination to keep this particular refinery offline, and, from the Russian side, a persistent inability to adequately defend it or to complete repairs before the next wave arrives. It's worth stepping back from Syzran itself to place this strike within the broader pattern of what has become a defining feature of this stage of the war, a sustained Ukrainian campaign against Russia's oil refining and energy export infrastructure, executed almost entirely through long-range unmanned aerial systems rather than through manned aircraft or missiles, which Ukraine has in far shorter supply. The logic behind this campaign, as Ukrainian officials and independent military analysts have described it publicly, is straightforward and has been stated many times. Russian oil exports and domestic fuel production help fund and fuel a military machine that is being used against Ukrainian cities and civilians. If that machine runs on fuel refined domestically within Russia, and if diplomatic pressure and sanctions alone have proven insufficient to meaningfully choke off that revenue and that fuel supply, then striking the refineries directly becomes, from Kiev's perspective, both a military and an economic tool rolled into one. Reduce Russia's capacity to refine crude oil, and you reduce its capacity to export refined products for hard currency, to supply its own domestic economy with gasoline and diesel, and, at least in part, to keep its military vehicles and aircraft fueled. The weapon of choice in the majority of these deep strikes has increasingly been identified as the FP-1, a Ukrainian-produced long-range strike drone. Precise technical specifications for these systems are understandably not published in full detail by either side, but what has become clear through more than a year of documented strikes is that these systems are capable of flying well over 1,000 kilometers from launch to target, carrying warheads substantial enough to cause the kind of structural damage seen at Syzran and at dozens of other refineries, storage depots, and export terminals across Russian territory since this campaign accelerated. What makes the FP-1 and similar systems strategically significant isn't necessarily their individual sophistication compared to a cruise missile, but their relative cost, their production scale, and the fact that Ukraine has been able to manufacture them domestically in growing numbers, even as Western military aid packages have fluctuated and, at various points, been delayed or reduced. Reports from mid-2026 suggest that Ukraine has been approving more than 2 new domestically produced drone systems a day on average this year, with the overwhelming majority of them now built using domestic components rather than imported ones. That detail matters enormously for understanding why this campaign has been sustainable in a way that earlier, more sporadic long-range strikes were not. A weapon that depends on foreign supply chains is subject to the political and logistical whims of foreign governments. A weapon built almost entirely at home is subject only to Ukraine's own industrial capacity and its own strategic priorities, both of which appear to have scaled up substantially over the past year. The night of July 11th into 12th was not, notably, limited to the strike on Syzran. In the same overnight window, drones also struck maritime targets in the Sea of Azov region, an area of the Black Sea Basin that has become another focal point of Ukraine's efforts to disrupt Russian fuel logistics, this time aimed at tankers rather than fixed refining infrastructure. Reports from the Rostov region, on Russia's southern coast, described a drone strike on a tanker transiting the Donazov Canal, with the regional governor confirming the strike, while also claiming that Russian air defenses had intercepted more than 20 other drones in that area during the same window. This tanker strike followed an earlier attack just days before, on July 9th, in which 2 tankers were reported damaged and set ablaze by drones in Taganrog Bay, itself following an even larger claimed operation by Ukraine's General Staff, which asserted that a dozen Russian tankers had been destroyed or disabled in the Sea of Azov as part of a broader effort to interdict vessels that Ukrainian officials say were actively supplying fuel to Russian military units and exporting petroleum products in violation of international sanctions regimes. Taken together, these are not isolated, unconnected incidents. They form a pattern that has been building steadily for well over a year, and which by mid-2026 had become something close to a routine feature of the war's rhythm. Refineries hit deep in the Russian interior, tankers hit along maritime supply routes, storage depots and pumping infrastructure targeted in between, all aimed at squeezing the physical infrastructure that turns crude oil into usable fuel and gets that fuel to where it's needed, whether that's a domestic gas station in Samara or a fuel depot supporting Russian forces near the front line in Ukraine. The economic dimension of this campaign is difficult to overstate, even though its exact financial impact is inherently hard to measure with precision from outside Russia. Oil and gas revenues have long formed one of the central pillars of the Russian federal budget, and refined products, in particular, represent value-added exports that generate more revenue per barrel than raw crude alone. There is the immediate loss of production and the associated revenue. There's the domestic effect on fuel availability and pricing in the region the refinery serves. Since Russia has periodically experienced localized fuel shortages and price spikes in areas whose primary supplying refinery has been taken offline by strikes, sometimes forcing authorities to redirect fuel supplies from elsewhere in the country, or to impose temporary export restrictions on gasoline and diesel to stabilize the domestic market. And there is the slower cumulative effect of repeated strikes on the same facilities, which forces Russian industry into an expensive and difficult cycle of ongoing repair, often complicated by the fact that international sanctions have cut off access to much of the specialized Western equipment and components that Russian refineries were historically built and maintained with. Replacing a damaged distillation column or a reforming unit is not simply a matter of Russian engineers pouring concrete and welding pipe. It frequently requires precision components that are increasingly difficult and expensive to source, whether through domestic substitutes of uncertain quality or through gray market channels via third countries. From a purely military logistics standpoint, the significance of a facility like Syzran lies in its role supplying fuel not just to civilian markets, but, according to Ukrainian assessments, directly into the logistics chains that keep Russian military units operational, particularly the aviation fuel component, given that the plant is noted to produce jet kerosene alongside its civilian products. Modern mechanized warfare, of the kind that has characterized this war since its earliest days, is extraordinarily fuel-intensive. Tanks, armored vehicles, transport trucks, and aircraft all consume enormous quantities of refined fuel, and a sustained campaign against refining capacity, even if it never fully halts Russian fuel production nationally, forces the Russian military and Russian industry into a constant state of triage, prioritizing which units and which regions receive fuel first, rerouting supply chains around damaged facilities, and absorbing the costs and delays that come with operating an infrastructure network under sustained, unpredictable attack. On the Russian side, the response to these strikes has followed a fairly consistent pattern over the past year, one that was largely repeated after the July 12th strike on Syzran. Official confirmation tends to come slowly and in fragments, often through regional officials rather than federal ministries, frequently limited to bare acknowledgement that a drone attack occurred and that a fire resulted, without detailed information about the scale of damage, the number of casualties, if any, or the operational status of the facility going forward. This pattern reflects both an information environment in which Russian authorities have strong incentives to minimize public perception of vulnerability, and a broader wartime posture in which detailed disclosures about damage to critical infrastructure are treated as matters of national security, withheld from public reporting, regardless of how visible the smoke over a regional capital might be to residents with cell phone cameras. Russian air defense claims, when they are made, tend to report large numbers of drones intercepted or destroyed across the country on any given night, sometimes in the hundreds, without always distinguishing clearly between decoys, drones that missed their targets by chance, and drones that were genuinely intercepted by active countermeasures. Independent verification of these figures from outside Russia is extremely difficult, which is part of why open-source analysts working from geolocated video, satellite imagery, and cross-referenced telegram reporting have become such a central part of how this war's infrastructure campaign gets documented and understood by outside observers at all. It's worth pausing on that point because it says something notable about how this particular war is being chronicled in near real time. Much of what the outside world learns about strikes like the one on Syzran doesn't come from official statements by either government, but from a decentralized ecosystem of monitoring channels, satellite imagery analysts, and ordinary residents filming what's happening around them and posting it within minutes. That eyewitness footage, chaotic and unpolished as it is, has become a genuine primary source in a way that would have been unimaginable in earlier conflicts. Voices caught on phone cameras, watching drones circle overhead and calling out to each other, form part of the evidentiary record that analysts later cross-reference against satellite passes and geolocate against known facility layouts to determine, days or weeks later, exactly which units were hit and how badly. It is a strange, almost improvised form of open-source journalism, built not by trained correspondents on the ground, but by residents whose ordinary lives happen to intersect with a strategic strike, filming from balconies and courtyards, because that is where they happened to be standing when the sirens went off. Within a day of the strike, satellite imagery had reportedly confirmed much of what the initial ground-level footage suggested. Analysis published by monitoring channels described the AVT-5 unit burning at multiple separate points, technical pipe racks damaged across large sections of the plant, and significant additional damage visible at the AVT-6 unit as well, corroborating the assessment that this strike had achieved something closer to a complete disabling of the plant's primary processing capability rather than a partial or superficial hit. Some Ukrainian and independent analysts characterize the July 12th strike as potentially the most significant single result of the broader refinery campaign in months, given the apparent scope of damage across every one of the plant's primary units simultaneously, an outcome that previous strikes on the same facility, despite their frequency, had not fully achieved in one operation. Local authorities in the Samara region, for their part, offered a more limited public account, attributing the fire and initial statements to falling drone debris rather than direct impact, a framing commonly used by Russian regional officials in the aftermath of these strikes, one that tends to downplay the precision or intentionality of the attack while still acknowledging that a fire occurred. Whether that framing reflects an honest assessment of what actually happened on the ground, or simply a preferred narrative for public consumption, is difficult to determine with certainty from outside sources, and it's the kind of detail where healthy skepticism toward statements from all sides remains warranted, particularly in the fog of a live conflict where both militaries have clear incentives to shape public perception of their own successes and the other side's failures. Stepping back further still, this strike arrives within a broader diplomatic and political moment that adds additional context to why it matters beyond the immediate damage to one refinery. The war, by mid-2026, is in its 5th year, a duration that has reshaped assumptions on both sides about what kind of conflict this has become and how it might eventually end. International diplomatic efforts have continued in parallel with the fighting, including gatherings of what's often referred to as the Coalition of the Willing, a grouping of countries coordinating military and economic support for Ukraine, discussing, among other things, how to sustain pressure on Russia's war economy over the medium and long term. Strikes on Russian energy infrastructure sit at an interesting intersection of that broader strategy, since they represent a form of pressure that doesn't rely on Western governments, approving new aid packages or lifting restrictions on how supplied weapons can be used deep inside Russian territory, given that these are domestically produced Ukrainian systems operating under Ukraine's own targeting decisions, rather than under the political constraints that have sometimes limited the use of Western-supplied long-range weapons against targets inside Russia proper. That independence is strategically significant in its own right. For much of the earlier years of the war, Ukraine's ability to strike deep inside Russian territory was constrained not just by the range of available weapons, but by political conditions attached to Western-supplied systems, many of which came with explicit restrictions against being used to strike targets on Russian soil, out of concern among some allied governments about escalation risk. The growth of Ukraine's domestic long-range drone industry has effectively sidestepped that constraint for an entire category of weapon, allowing Kyiv to conduct a sustained deep strike campaign against Russian energy infrastructure using systems that were never subject to those foreign-imposed restrictions in the first place, because they were never foreign supplied to begin with. That shift, more than any single strike, may be the more consequential story running underneath the smoke over Syzran, a demonstration of how far Ukraine's indigenous defense industrial capacity has come, and how that capacity has begun to change the practical geography and political calculus of the war, extending meaningful strike capability across virtually the entire depth of Russian territory, from refineries near the Baltic coast in the northwest to facilities well beyond the Ural Mountains in the country's interior. What happens next at Syzran, in the narrower sense, will likely follow a pattern familiar from the plant's own history over the past year. An uncertain period of assessment, a period of reduced or halted output while Russian engineers work to assess and begin repairs, complicated by the sanctions. Driven difficulty of sourcing replacement equipment, and if the pattern established by strikes in August of 2025, April of this year, and May of this year is any guide, a return to at least partial operations at some point in the following weeks or months, only for the facility to remain a standing target for future strikes, given its demonstrated strategic value and its history of repeated selection by Ukrainian planners. Whether this particular strike, given the apparent scale of damage across all of the plant's primary units simultaneously, represents a more prolonged disruption than previous attacks, is something that will likely only become clear through continued satellite monitoring and open-source analysis over the coming weeks, since neither Rosneft nor Russian federal authorities have historically provided detailed, verifiable public updates on repair timelines or restored production capacity at facilities hit by these strikes. In the broader arc of the war, the Syzran strike is unlikely to be remembered as a singular turning point in the way that a major battlefield offensive or a significant diplomatic breakthrough might be. It is, instead, one more entry in a long and steadily growing ledger, one refinery among dozens that have now been struck at least once, and in Syzran's case, now more than a dozen times, since Ukraine's long-range drone campaign against Russian energy infrastructure began in earnest. But, taken cumulatively, that ledger tells its own story about how this war has evolved, from a conflict initially defined by frontline maneuver and territorial control, to one increasingly defined as well by a parallel campaign against the economic and logistical foundations that allow either side to keep fighting at all. The residents of Syzran, who stood outside in the dark on the morning of July 12th, watching drones circle over their city and filming the fire that followed, found themselves, without ever choosing to be, witnesses to a small but telling chapter in that larger story, one being written night after night, refinery after refinery, deep inside a country that once assumed its interior was simply too far away to reach. It's also worth considering what this kind of strike looks like from the perspective of ordinary life continuing around it, because that's ultimately what the raw footage from Syzran captures better than any statistic about processing capacity or annual tonnage ever could. A city wakes up to sirens. A crowd gathers, not because anyone summoned them, but because a fire large enough to light up the sky draws people out of their homes almost involuntarily. Someone in the crowd tells another person to stop filming, worried perhaps about drawing further attention, or perhaps simply repeating a habit of wartime caution that has become second nature after years of this. Someone else keeps filming anyway, because the instinct to document what's happening outweighs the instinct to hide from it. A voice calls out that a drone is turning, that it appears to be heading toward the crowd itself. And for a moment, the fear in that voice is not abstract or strategic. It's the very immediate fear of a person watching a weapon change direction in the sky above their own neighborhood. Then it passes, aimed instead at another smokestack, another piece of industrial infrastructure, and the crowd exhales and keeps watching. This is the texture of modern deep strike warfare as experienced by civilians who live near strategic infrastructure but are not themselves the intended targets, caught in a position where they are neither combatants nor entirely bystanders, close enough to feel the concussion of each impact, far enough to survive it, tasked with nothing more than watching their region's economic backbone burn from a safe distance and trying to make sense of what they're seeing in real time, often with less information than the analysts thousands of kilometers away, poring over the same footage the next morning. There's also a longer historical frame worth placing around all of this, because striking an adversary's oil infrastructure to degrade its capacity to wage war is not a new idea born of this particular conflict. Air campaigns against refineries and fuel production have been a recurring feature of major wars for the better part of a century, from strategic bombing campaigns against synthetic fuel plants in earlier conflicts, to more recent efforts by various militaries to target an opponent's energy infrastructure as a way of constraining its logistics without necessarily engaging its forces directly on a battlefield. What distinguishes the current campaign against Russian refineries is less the underlying strategic logic, which is quite old, than the method. A sustained, essentially uninterrupted campaign carried out almost entirely by low-cost, domestically produced unmanned systems, launched from a country that does not possess anything resembling a traditional long-range strategic bombing force, executed at a tempo and over a duration that would have been difficult to imagine using conventional manned aircraft, which are expensive, vulnerable to sophisticated air defenses, and require trained pilots whose lives are put directly at risk with every sortie. A drone that fails to reach its target, or that is shot down en route, represents a financial loss and nothing more. That distinction, subtle as it might sound, has fundamentally changed the economics and the risk calculus of sustained deep strike campaigns, allowing a much smaller and less resourced country to conduct a bombing campaign of a scale and persistence that would once have required an air force many times its size. None of this changes the fact that verified, independently confirmed details about strikes, like the one on Syzran, remain genuinely difficult to establish with full certainty in the days immediately following an attack. Casualty figures, precise repair timelines, the exact operational status of a damaged facility weeks or months later, and the true scale of economic impact are all pieces of information that tend to emerge slowly, if at all, filtered through sources with their own interests in how the story gets told. What can be said with reasonable confidence, based on the convergence of satellite imagery, geolocated video, and reporting from multiple independent outlets, is that a significant strike occurred at a major Rosneft refinery in Samara Oblast in the early hours of July 12th. That it appears to have struck the facility's primary crude processing units rather than peripheral infrastructure, and that it represents the latest and possibly most damaging in a lengthening series of attacks on a single facility that has now been targeted more than a dozen times over roughly the past year, a pattern that shows no clear sign of stopping as this war moves deeper into its fifth year.